So welcome back, everyone, to our New Voices talk series of women and their body. Today we will hear Marjolein Oele. She is professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco. She was trained as an MD at the Free University of Amsterdam. She has a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Amsterdam, and she received her PhD in philosophy in 2007 from Loyola University Chicago. Her research intertwines ancient philosophy, continental philosophy, environmental philosophy, and philosophy of medicine. She's the author of Eco-Affectivity, Exploring Pathos at Life's Material Interfaces, and co-editor of Ontologies of Nature, Continental Perspectives, and Environmental Reorientations. She's currently working on a new book, manuscript entitled Element Loose. Her articles have been published in a range of journals, including Ancient Philosophy, Configurations, Environmental Philosophy, Epoche, Graduate Faculty Philosophy Journal, Radical Philosophy, Reviews and Research in Phenomenology. She is a member of the Executive Board of the Pacific Association for the Continental Tradition, and she joined the editorial board of the journal Environmental Philosophy in 2017 as its book review editor. And today she will speak of Pregnant Constellations and the Demise, a Phenomenology of Miscarriage. So I leave the floor to you, and many thanks for having accepted to speak to us today.
Thank you, Dr. Muller, for your kind invitation. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into today's presentation. I'm very happy to share my work here with you today, and I most look forward to the discussion. I have prepared a PowerPoint, which I will currently share. So onto the title of my presentation, which is slightly different from the publication on which it is based, which is forthcoming in a book entitled The Vulnerability of the Human World, which is co-edited by Susie Ferrarello and Elodie Boublil. And I'm excited to share with you my thoughts, which are, of course, never done. And I'm very much interested in any phenomenology of pregnancy and pregnancy loss. So I wanted to briefly talk to you about my philosophical interest in this theme, which intersects with my philosophical exploration of the topic of ambiguous ephemeral loss. And as Dr. Muller already announced, I'm currently working on a new book manuscript called Elemental Loss, which is about shifting constellations of water, fire, air, and earth. And in that book, I address the topic of ephemeral ambiguous loss, where I argue that rather than speaking of loss as an event or as pertaining to one individualized being, such as in the case of losing person X, Y, or Z, my account of ephemeral loss thematizes what I call infinite small and slow changes that compose loss. Now, in the book manuscript, I argue that many of those changes have been mediated through what the pre-Socratic philosophers have called the classical elements of water, fire, air, and earth. And I argue that specifically in a time of environmental crisis, all those four elements have undergone radical ultimate shifts leading to loss. For instance, air pollution making life increasingly unbreathable, wildfires making shelters impossible, etc. So in that regard, the book project on elemental loss seeks to formulate a new epistemology in line with changes in the elemental space, thereby seeking to push against the sense of individuated loss so as to redraw the boundaries of what loss and grief are in a time of climate change. So that book project and that current book project really sort of tries to think through loss away from individuated loss, tries to think about slow changes, thinks about constellations that are shifting, and tries to argue for an intersection of natural and cultural factors in terms of how we experience those shifts in constellations. So that's one entry point into this project, to think about loss away from individuated loss towards a sense of shifting constellations. Now, the second entry point into the topic is through autobiography. And here I've worked a little bit more on creative nonfiction writing, and I'll share with you one of those write-ups that I have about that experience. And increasingly, my work sort of intertwines some of those autobiographical excerpts to also show where my writing finds its point of departure. And that is very much in line, of course, with my own continental upbringing in academia. I stare out of the window into the night, trolley buses zipping by, their shrill sounds piercing the foggy air. Lights in neighboring homes across the street gradually dim. while the surgery earlier this afternoon so effectively and painlessly removed the remaining tissues of what is suddenly called miscarriage, the aftermath feels raw, surreal, uneasy, emptied out of what, of whom, and now. Pregnancy has been a life-changing experience for me, not only because of the profound bodily transformation that I underwent and the amazing two forms of life that emerged in the forms of my two children, but also because of its painful loss. And here, briefly wanting to footnote this, I am addressing here miscarriage in terms of loss, because that is for me a personally felt dimension of loss. That's not to say that miscarriage ought to feel that kind of loss or that is the same kind of experience for others. So that's an important footnote here. And also, of course, an important footnote given the whole range of different kinds of experiences that may be associated with what is called miscarriage. Now, the experience of pregnancy loss and miscarriage prompted me to ask a simple yet profound question. How can I, as a woman philosopher, conceptualize the ambiguity of early pregnancy loss, and how may I grasp its lingering pain? And more strategically, how may I, with the conceptual forces that undergird my philosophical existence, come to the aid of others who have been similarly affected and combat our current cultural discourse that is unfit to address the ambivalence surrounding early pregnancy loss, as it silences miscarriage and thereby compounding suffering? And on this notion of suffering, quite a few books have been written, and only recently have there emerged a few discourses on the philosophy of miscarriage. Now, one way to access the meaning of pregnancy loss is to think of pregnancy as the emergence of what I call a pregnant constellation. More specifically, in previous work, such as in my book project, Eco-Affectivity, I have proposed to view pregnancy as the building of what I call a pregnant city, analogous to Plato's building of a city or a polis in the Republic. To illustrate, Plato's city offers a new beginning built upon a division of labor and a specialization of its parts. Yet the city is unified in its common goal and functioning, as it is protected and inspired through its demonic philosophical guardians. Similarly, I've argued, pregnancy as a new beginning is based upon a division of labor of emergent parts that are connected and differentiated through mimetic bonds, and are unified by a common goal that may sometimes be detrimental to one or more of these parts. Furthermore, like the guardian philosophers that install a city, the pregnant city is installed by a very particular organ of the in-between, which I call the placenta guardian. In his Republic, Plato paints a city in thought and wants to start anew through a new educational system, a new organization of this political system. And similarly, I argue, pregnancy installs a new regime, the pregnant city, that organizes a new communal body in a newly emerging place and time. So again, briefly addressing this, my writings on pregnancy and the pregnant city have focused on really elevating and analyzing the materiality based on scientific research of the placenta, and how the placenta, rather than a top-down philosophical leaders of Plato's city, rather from the bottom up, the placenta installs what I call a pregnant city. And as I've mentioned, the pregnant city can sometimes be at the detriment of its parts, such as the pregnant body that may suffer due to the installation of that regime. Now, if pregnancy can be characterized by the building of a pregnant city, then what happens when the emerging pregnant city falls apart prematurely? Here, my analysis focuses on the liminal experience of early miscarriage, which medically is defined as miscarriage before the 12th gestational week, which is, I argue, important for 3 reasons. First, this form of ephemeral loss is conceptually underarticulated, yet experientially prevalent. And some early estimates currently have it that about 70% of conceptions end in loss. That is 70%, so the majority of it. Second, redefining early pregnancy loss stimulates correction of many accounts of loss that are predominantly focused on the individuated singular beings rather than loss at the level of the milieu, at the level of the context of the joint constellation. Now, third, recognizing the importance and prevalence of dissipating constellations and the way that they perforate the model of the autonomous self may bring further understanding and recognition to those caught in the grieving aftermath of miscarriage. So these are really kind of my 3 points why I think this project might be significant. In what way can the formerly pregnant woman mourn? That is, how can loss be present to her if there is no question of a lost individual, but rather a dissolving pregnant constellation? Since in early pregnancy, the pregnant woman does not yet stand in relationship to the fetus to be as its mother, and neither may there even be a fetus to whom to stand in. For instance, in the case of molar pregnancies, where there is no particular early fetus, then the loss experienced is incomparable to losing a mother, a child, or a sibling. So what does loss mean, I ask, when it pertains to something devoid of a concrete identity, either on its own or through a concrete relationship? Now, in this presentation, I will show that French philosopher Gilles Simondon's account of pre-individuation is a helpful tool to both conceptualize the pregnancy in its early formation and also in its dissolution. Moreover, I will examine Simondon's discussion of the metaphysics of life that focuses not on being, but on being as becoming, that is, as ontogenesis. And more elaborately in eco-affectivity, I really focus on sort of this contestation of Heidegger's philosophy on the question of being, and I focus much more on this question of the material becoming or ontogenesis. Now, using Simondon's philosophy, I will argue that miscarriage confronts us with being held captive by what I call an amorphous marginal in-between porous temporal space that will not or cannot leap back towards our own individuation, the individuated life to be, and a socially recognized altered collectivity. So that's my thesis, which I'll try to prove in what follows. So onto section 1, which is about colloquial and scientific accounts of miscarriage and thinking through the definition, etiology, and prevalence of miscarriage. So here I go over a number of definitions, explain what they mean, and I also will clarify why I might contest some of those explorations. The Oxford English Dictionary defines miscarriage as, and I quote, the spontaneous expulsion of a fetus from the womb before it is viable, end quote. Its etymology, miscarriage, conveys the sense of an improper, amiss, a way of carrying or bearing from one place to another. With the exception of ectopic pregnancies, which are pregnancies which take place outside of the uterus and which can be life-threatening due to internal bleeding, current medical definitions of miscarriage take a very different trajectory. They actually highlight the factual determination of pregnancy and the lack thereof, tracing thereby former presence through medical techniques such as ultrasound or microscopic evaluations. The revised 2005 terminology from the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology informs the following definition used by Larson, and here I'm quoting. The term clinical miscarriage is used when ultrasound examination or histological evidence has confirmed that an intrauterine pregnancy has existed, end quote. As this latter, Larson's definition proves, medical science, in distinction to cultural definitions, does not define miscarriage in terms of spatial removal or exclusion, or even of improper movement, such as in the term miscarrying. Instead, medical science focuses upon the emergence of nothingness out of a prior state of being. This state of emergent nothingness is further temporalized according to various temporal intervals, such as that this loss is subdivided in losses that take place in the first trimester, the so-called early pregnancy loss, and those that take place in the second trimester, so-called late pregnancy losses. Now, what we can learn from this initial medical definition of miscarriage is that pregnancy loss is seen in terms of presence versus absence and is assessed according to temporal duration. Notably, the medical definition provided steers the colloquial question of misplacement into a question of disappearance. Thus, we are prompted to ask, how is it that a pregnancy prematurely falls apart? If the focus is on those pregnancy losses that are most common, that is, early pregnancy losses that are sporadic rather than recurrent, then medicine's answer is that most pregnancy losses are caused by abnormal chromosomal development of the fetus, and specifically abnormal numbering of chromosomes. As Bardos writes, and I quote, the vast majority, that is 60% of miscarriages, are the results of aneuploidy, which is the condition of having an abnormal number of chromosomes, end quote. Now, if we follow this medical line of reasoning into the etiology, namely that the occurrence of serious structural malformations or chromosomal aberrations are incompatible with life, then the most common forms of pregnancy loss are not, in this view, pathological phenomena, but they are actually the very opposite, especially once they are viewed from a biological evolutionary perspective. In that instance, they are part of what Larson calls a true physiological phenomenon. For what may be experientially or existentially be viewed as a pathos, that is, a loss associated with suffering, qualitative change, as the ancient Greeks would have it, is medically speaking not meaningful in that pathological sense, but really seen as a physiological preservation of successful life. That is a life that is developmentally viable and successfully functional. The aim being successful survival of a species and reproductive adaptability to circumstances, provides the reason for a life that, physiological and evolutionary speaking, may paradoxically include miscarriage or infertility, as studies on the intertwining factors of environment, evolution, and reproduction show. Now, along those lines, Larson speaks of this kind of miscarriage as, I quote, representing nature's quality control system, preventing embryos with several abnormalities in most cases from progressing beyond the peri-implantation period, end quote. Now, if we follow Larson's argument here, then what does this yield, I ask, in terms of the meaning of pregnancy loss? For them, what may be otherwise, Larson, as well as other embryologists, focus on the issue of viability and success of fertility. For them, what may otherwise be experienced as a pathos, a loss, a sense of sadness, is rendered here as physos, or as physiology. That is the way in which a living organism or bodily part functions. If Larson's medical training makes her, like other embryologists, focus on the viability and success of life and birth, speaking of preserving quality control rather than acknowledging loss, then this has serious repercussions for the meaning of miscarriage. What is emphasized in this account is a futural trajectory of the species and its general physiological adaptation to evolving lives and environments. What is overlooked, however, is this notion of pathos, even if some form of emerging life would not have been viable, either because of itself or because of its milieu, or the intertwinement between being and milieu, then it is undeniably still the case that some form of emergent life and or some peculiar pregnant relationship has been lost. This is true even if this form of emerging life or this emerging pregnant constellation would not have been viable given the circumstances. What medicine thereby overlooks and ignores is the interpellation of what I call a different set of questions that early pregnancy loss poses. Rather than focusing upon the species and its successful adaptation to the environment and its survival, early pregnancy loss prompts us to think through the relational ontogenesis, to contemplate losses of a pre-reflective nature that never even became personal relationships. It asks us to ponder loss at the intersection of nothing, being, and becoming. It thereby also asks us to consider grief beyond the finite individual, and to feel the accumulated weight of a loss we share but do not possess. Similar to how birth offers a link, as Cavarero argues, from living individuals to life itself, then early pregnancy loss opens up a conceptual path to grasp the link between finite losses to amorphous loss itself. That is, a loss deep and pervasive and intimately connected with the origins of life. To expand, the loss that is early pregnancy loss is felt not just now, but is temporally built upon what may be called, in my view, a graveyard of losses. Over and against public opinion, which mistakenly believes miscarriage is rare, miscarriage is rather common and part of what Larson has called the pregnancy loss iceberg. With an estimated, and I've mentioned this number earlier, with an estimated 70% of conceptions that are lost prior to live birth, and that's an estimation. If this is the case, namely that the large majority of conceptions end up in some form of pregnancy loss, then the weight of this loss may be heavier than we thought. How can we thematize this seemingly infinite past of loss upon which our present and future lives may be built? And once again, how can we create a conceptual effective place from out of which we can grieve those losses that never even became part of our personal relationships, since they never became individuated? So here I turn to Simondon's analysis on grasping the emergence of being towards becoming. In the second section, in the longer version of the published book chapter, I focus also on various psychological theories of loss and grief. And I turn to, for instance, Butler, but also to Pauline Boss and her work on ambiguous loss to kind of get a handle on how psychologically and philosophically we might understand different senses of loss beyond that of individuation. But here, since I have time constraints, I'm focusing on the next section, which is the more philosophically robust section in terms of underpinning my argument. Most theorists of loss have focused, as I've mentioned, on individuated losses. Now, what if the focus of early pregnancy and early pregnancy loss is precisely that of a certain ontogenetic process and relationship that predates relationships between individuals? I argue that Simondon's account of what he calls pre-individuation may be a helpful tool to conceptualize the pregnant city in its early formation, precisely because it thematizes the pre-individual place that pregnancy taps into. And here I quote from Simondon. The individual is to be understood as having a relative reality, occupying only a certain phase of the whole being in question. A phase that therefore carries the implication of a preceding pre-individual state, and that even after individuation does not exist in isolation, since individuation does not exhaust in the single act of its appearance all the potentials embedded in the pre-individual state. Individuation, moreover, not only brings the individual to light, but also the individual milieu dyad, end quote. In Simondon's perspective, an individual is only relative in existence because it is only part of what he calls the totality of the being, and because it is merely a result of a stage of a larger ontogenetic process that in itself is not individuated. Individuation, in his view, is only a partial and relative resolution. This entails that Simondon sees, and I quote, being not as a substance or matter or form, but as a totally extended and supersaturated system, which exists at a higher level than the unit itself, end quote. Being for Simondon, thereby, is neither a unit, nor can it be characterized by unity, since units or unities only come into existence after the process of individuation. With Simondon's articulation of the pre-individual and the potentialities, it entails we may formulate the process of early pregnancy in the following kind of way, namely as a process that interrupts and disrupts the individuated space of the physical unit, and in its interpellation creates a bond between an individuated place, that of the pregnant body, towards the pre-individual space. Pregnancy may thus be called what I term the experience of a bridge, of connective tissue, of a semi-permeable membrane where the pull of a relative reality is felt ever so strongly. It is a plane of creativity that transpires through the individual, yet is beyond it. This is a plane of emergence, namely a plane of potentialities without predetermined teleologies. While she may not psychically be aware of this, a woman's body in becoming pregnant is itself emphatically engaging with this relative reality, becoming part of a new creative regime that it doesn't know but simply embodies. The new creative regime that emerges is reflective of the status of the pre-individual. The pre-individual, in Simondon's words, is something beyond a unity and an identity, something capable of being manifested as either a wave, a corpuscle, matter, or energy, end quote. As Elizabeth Gross explains in her commentary on Simondon, she says the pre-individual, and I quote, has no individual nor collective contents, and is what she calls the meta-stable order from which beings, or rather becomings, engender themselves, end quote. In using the term metastable, a term inherited from non-equilibrium thermodynamics, Simondon aims to describe a state that, as Gross explains it, retains unexhausted potentials that require the generation of a new order to explicate or develop these potentials and keep them contained and cohesive, end quote. Now, if this thought of the pre-individual regime is applied to early pregnancy, then the pre-individual regime that emerges perforates holes in the individuated, unified maternal body, as well as in our conceptualization of pregnancy as a relationship between two individuated beings. What emerges, if we follow Simondon's view, is not a new collective togetherness, since there is, at least initially, not yet togetherness between individualities, especially as there may even not be a new unit or unity yet of emerging life, such as in the case of molar pregnancies. Certainly, on the side of the potential embryo, certain specific potencies may have arisen, but the larger landscape within which this operates is that of a new terrain, a pre-collective, pre-individuated, metastable state that informs both prematernal and pre-fetal life. We could thus speak here of something like a pregnant city, as I've indicated before, but only in the sense of a city before its individuated inhabitants are formed, since it mostly holds open opportunities for all future emergent constituents. Now, that means that in the case of early pregnancy, a new regime takes hold that, given the smallest perturbation, and here I'm quoting again from Elizabeth Gross, generates a powerful change in the system's functioning and enables it to evolve, end quote. This metastable state that is the pre-individual thus harbors a certain incompatibility within itself. And it is through the process of becoming that we can, in retrospect, discern an abrupt capacity to double ourselves. A capacity that Simondon argues is something that beings possess of falling out of step with themselves, end quote. Becoming in this process is not different from being, but is rather one of the dimensions of being, a mode of resolving an initial incompatibility that was rife with potentials. Now, this doubling, the falling out of step of the pre-individual, duplicates what Gross calls the forces of the real within the emergent individual at a different level or order, and gives thereby rise to new levels and orders of the real. This enables the individual produced to intervene and transform the pre-individual and its milieu. Now, the doubling that Simondon speaks of here has special resonance for the process of pregnancy. Having instituted a new metastable pre-individual state, it is out of the process of doubling and falling out of step with oneself that being may allow for the emergence of various stages of becoming, of stages where the pre-individual can become both the placental and the embodied milieu for maternal and fetal becoming. Pregnancy thus carries pre-individuated mimetic resonance by installing a pre-individuated regime that, in a so-called successful pregnancy, also becomes transformed into a milieu that fosters both the growth of the body of the potential mother, as well as the growth of the potential fetus and the placenta. Pregnancy thus carries pre-individuated mimetic resonance across the various milieus of the pregnant city, unfolding potentialities that themselves unlock other various futural communal becomings. In more concrete terms, once the pre-individuated state becomes materialized as a milieu, we may distinguish at least three forms of communal places where aspects of the pre-individual feature. First, this is the new present collective in terms of the pregnant city as we have addressed it. Two, pregnancy may form the bridge to the past pre-individual communal place, out of which the pregnant city emerges, for instance, in the form of genetic, epigenetic, contextual, or microchimeric traces. And three, pregnancy calls up through material and possibly emotional and cognitive anticipation, the future of a new physical and social collective to be had after birth. If the pre-individual is duplicated, then it brings to the forefront the emergence of communal places and times and the possibilities that they give rise to. Thus, along the lines of Simondon's thought, pregnancy indexes that any attempt at individuation is always fundamentally pre-collective and pre-individuated, which loosens up any expectations of holding pregnancy simply captive in the language of opposition, such as individuation or collectivity, past, present, or future, matter or form, space or time, or concept or material. Here I turn to some of the consequences of Simondon's theory for understanding early pregnancy loss, and I focus mostly here on faltered leaps. Now, Simondon's account of the pre-individual and the process of ontogenesis holds promise, I argue, for a more profound account of early miscarriage. Simondon's theory allows us to think about pregnancy in terms of tapping into and re-emerging from a pre-individuated space full of uneasy tensions and points of access that are central to ontogenesis. If we follow this train of thought, early pregnancy loss involves, what I argue, losing a bridge to a pre-individual space, and also entails a confrontation with a form of loss that suspends the transition to a collective future. For Bernard Stiegler, following Simondon, the death of the individual involves a loss that does not denigrate the collective, but instead allows one to understand that each individuated psychic being, and I quote here from Stiegler, always carries forward as originally collective in this sense, going beyond itself into a future that exceeds its own disappearance and to which it delivers its own inadequation. Stiegler's account is important for grasping early pregnancy loss, since it reveals that it is so painful precisely because it involves losing a bridge to a pre-individuated space, and thereby freezes the process of the emergence of individuation before life can take a leap or rupture with its source, which would ultimately find resolution in a collective future. In early pregnancy loss, on the one hand then, the formerly pregnant body moves forward into a future that is forever altered due to the microchimeric traces of the dissipating pregnancy in one's body. Here, one's body testifies to the past and to the different futures opened up by the dissolving constellation. Yet, on the other hand, the mourner is unable to return back to normal and or finds no outright hard confirmation in social relations that one's future has forever changed, which could make it very difficult to pull forward affirmatively into a collective future. Moreover, while so-called successful pregnancies seem to underline linear teleological progression and emergence of individuation out of the pre-individual, early pregnancy loss following Simondon shows us the messy nature of ontogenesis, precisely as it emphasizes the material space of ontogenesis with its tipping points that can go either way, its contingencies, its various points of access, and its struggle between forces that coexist uneasily. If ever we thought birth is linear and teleological, then the miscarriage iceberg confronts us with the all too real messy work of ontogenesis taking place around points of instability. The tipping point that in the case of a so-called successful pregnancy allows for a unification of being, that is, the emergence of individuation and the potential futural collectivity between potential parent and potential child, now makes itself felt in pregnancy loss as an imploded state of stagnant semi-stability. It seemingly returns everything to its old state without that being the case. How may we philosophically address this altered individual milieu dyad? What do the lack of words or rituals do to this altered interface within which we may live? If the pre-individuated space does not, at least not visibly or in socially recognized ways, leap into a successful new communal milieu, while the formerly pregnant body may still be profoundly affected by its invisible altered traces in the individual milieu dyad, what effects does this entail? And might this account for increased isolation fortified by cultural misrecognition and silence? If birth is in the end a radical rupture, and specifically a rupture with what I have called the emergent pregnant city, allowing for a newly installed communal milieu, then early miscarriage brings one back to uneasily being held captive by an amorphous marginal in-between porous space that will not or cannot leap, neither back towards our own individuation or that of the individuated life to be, and neither towards a socially recognized altered collectivity. So here I'm coming towards my conclusion. In this presentation, I have argued, starting from first-person experience and with a specific interest in ambiguous loss, that early pregnancy loss may confront one with a loss of words or concepts due to the ambiguity and the enigma of its loss. Moreover, the topic of miscarriage is culturally silenced, compounding suffering. Understanding the frequency of such occurrences of early pregnancy loss in terms of the miscarriage iceberg adds to the existential need to conceptualize such losses as they bleed into life at its very emergence. The prevalent cultural discourse on loss, even when it deals with ambiguity, is focused upon individuation and personhood, which may complicate the grieving process in the case of early pregnancy loss. In searching for alternative epistemologies to address this loss, I have proposed the following conceptual pathways. First, early pregnancy loss may be understood in terms of the dissipation of a pregnant constellation, thereby putting less emphasis on losing a being, but rather losing a sense of participation. This clarifies the kind of loss involved, but does not yet completely explain what kind of relationality is lost. Second of all, following Gilles Simondon's theory on ontogenesis, pregnancy loss involves losing a bridge to a pre-individual relationality, due to which the formerly pregnant body cannot easily leap back into former forms of individuation, nor leap forward into a socially recognized altered collectivity. This account is able, I argue, to clarify the kind of relational loss that is involved in early pregnancy loss. Now, concluding note, importantly, to learn how to theoretically address early miscarriage with a richer philosophical discourse may hold a future promise, namely to ease the pain of those suffering from early pregnancy loss and more generally allow for a profound insight, namely to acknowledge the mesmerizing, if enigmatic, pre-individual material undercurrent of our lives, and thereby to acknowledge the deeper foundations out of which we ourselves have emerged and to which we ultimately will return. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjolein Oele, for this very touching and highly scientific, interesting talk.